The clock on the mantel read 6:42 a.m. when I saw her. The air was cool, still holding the last vestiges of a damp night, and the rising sun was just beginning to burn the mist off the surface of Blackwood Lake. I was on my porch in my father-in-law's old rocking chair, holding a heavy ceramic mug of black coffee. It was a ritual, this quiet observation of the day as beginning, a time for peace. But she was a discordant note in the morning symphony. Her name was Carol, and she was standing on my land. She was not alone. Behind her, two men in matching green polo shirts stood beside a small tractor with a front-end loader and a chain attachment. They looked uncertain, glancing from her to the new fence I had spent the better part of the last week installing. It was a simple split-rail fence, more symbolic than defensive, tracing a line through the tall pines that separated my 2,200-acre inheritance from the manicured lawns of the Prestwick Bluffs subdivision. Carol pointed a commanding finger at the fence, her voice sharp enough to cut through the morning calm, and reach me across 200 yards of dew-soaked grass. I couldn't make out the words, but the intent was clear. She was giving orders. The men hesitated. One of them gestured vaguely in my direction, toward the house. She shook her head, a sharp, dismissive gesture. She wanted the fence gone. Now? I didn't move. Sure. I took a slow sip of my coffee, the warmth a small steadying comfort. I had been expecting this, not the tractor perhaps, but the confrontation. It was as inevitable as the sunrise. I had watched her for months, a queen in her self-appointed kingdom of beige houses and identical mailboxes. I had seen the letters she sent, the fines she levied, the way she made grown men wilt with a single condescending glare at their overgrown azaleas. I had seen her bully and intimidate her way into a position of absolute if petty power. And now she was on my property, attempting to tear down my fence. I set the mug down on the small table beside the rocker. I picked up my phone, which was already recording. I walked down the porch steps, my boots making soft impressions in the damp earth. I didn't hurry. There was no need. The situation was already well in hand, though she was the only person present who didn't know it. As I approached, her voice became clearer. It was pitched to carry a performance. For her small audience and illegal structure, she was saying, turning to face me as I closed the distance. This is an affront to the community and a blatant violation. You have blocked a historical access path that the residents of Prestwick Bluffs have used for over 20 years. I stopped about 15 feet away, letting the phone camera frame her, the tractor, and my fence in a single, damning shot. I said nothing. "I am Carol Miller," she announced, as if I were a visiting dignitary who needed to be informed of local customs. "I am the president of the Prestwick Bluffs Homeowners Association. I am informing you that this fence is on community property, and you have until noon today to remove it. If you do not, we will remove it for you, and you will be billed for the labor, in addition to an initial fine of $5,000, plus $1,000 for every day the violation remains." She paused, clearly expecting an argument, a denial, some sort of emotional response she could seize upon. I gave her none. I just stood there. The phone held steady. The silence seemed to unnerve her more than any protest could have. "Did you hear me?" she snapped, taking a step forward. "This is HOA land. Your little farm, or whatever this is, ends at the old stone wall. Everyone knows that." I remained silent. I kept the receipts. Metaphorically, in this case, the receipts were the survey markers I had located and flagged myself, the county plat map folded in my desk, and the 80-year-old deed stored in a fireproof safe. The stone wall she referred to was 150 feet inside my property line. "We will have this path cleared," she continued, her voice rising. "I will call the sheriff if I have to." We will put a lien on your property. So fast your head will spin. You have no idea who you're dealing with. That was where she was wrong. I knew exactly who I was dealing with. A performative tyrant, a creature of ego and assumption, a person who believed that the force of her will could literally bend reality to her liking, a person who never, ever did her homework. I finally lowered the phone. I looked her directly in the eye, my expression as neutral as I could make it. I thought about all the work ahead of me, the calls I would have to make, the documents I would have to assemble. I thought about the quiet life I had wanted here, the peace my late wife Eleanor had cherished in this place. A quiet life that was now, officially, on hold. But it was a necessary pause. Order had to be restored. And the process of restoring it had just begun. She had no idea. She had no idea she had just tried to bulldoze a fence belonging to a licensed land surveyor with 40 years of experience in boundary disputes. Colloq. She had no idea. She just declared war on the one man who knew exactly where every single property pin was buried. But before I tell you what I did next, sitting there, in my office, with the video of her trespass playing on a loop, I should probably explain how we got here. It didn't start with a fence, it started with a loss and a legacy. My wife, Eleanor, passed away 2 years ago. We had a good life together, a quiet life in the city, where I ran my civil engineering and surveying firm. Eleanor was brilliant, a professor of botany, but her heart was always here. At Blackwood Manor, the land that had been in her family since the late 1800s. 2,200 acres of timber, a 20-acre spring-fed lake, and the old stone and cedar homestead her great-grandfather had built. When she was gone, the city felt hollow. Our house was just a collection of rooms. So I retired, handed the firm over to my junior partner, and moved out to the manor full-time. It was what she would have wanted. My job was simple: to be a steward. To keep the land as it was, a quiet, wild place in a world that was getting louder and more crowded every day. My profession is one of precision. It is a world of absolutes. A boundary line is not a suggestion. A deed is not a piece of folklore. An easement is a legal instrument, not a matter of convenience. For 40 years I dealt in facts, in measurements that were verifiable down to the hundredth of an inch. My work was to find the truth buried in the dirt, etched on old maps, and recorded in dusty courthouse basements. It was a language of chains and links, of metes and bounds, of iron pins and concrete monuments. It was a world entirely alien to the one Carol Miller inhabited. The Prestwick Bluffs subdivision was built about 15 years ago, long before I moved here permanently. It was carved out of an old farm that bordered the eastern edge of the Blackwood property. It was marketed as exclusive country living, which meant half-acre lots, 4,000-square-foot houses that all looked vaguely the same, and a homeowners association with a book of covenants thicker than a city phone book. Eleanora's father, a kind but non-confrontational man, had watched its construction with a certain weary resignation. He had, in a gesture of goodwill, allowed some of the early residents to use an old logging trail that ran parallel to the property line for evening strolls. It was a handshake agreement, a neighborly accommodation. He never put it in writing, he never had to. People were reasonable then. But Eleanor's father passed away, and the original homeowners were replaced by a new, more aggressive type of suburbanite. The handshake agreement was forgotten, and in its place a myth was born. The myth of the community path. Carol Miller and her husband moved in about 6 years ago. From what I gathered from the few old-timers left, she immediately launched a campaign to take over the HOA board. She was charismatic in a sharp-edged way, and she spoke the language of rising property values and stringent aesthetic control. She won, of course. Her first act as president was to double the monthly dues, and hire a management company that seemed to specialize in issuing violation notices. Grass too long. A fine. Holiday decorations left up a day too late. A fine. Wah. A childish bicycle left in the driveway. A fine. She ruled Prestwick Bluffs with an iron fist and a 3-ring binder. Her masterpiece, her legacy, was the Clubhouse. Built 5 years ago, it was a monument to suburban aspiration. A $4 million stone and glass palace with a pool, tennis courts, and a banquet hall. It was situated on a high point of the HOA's common land, offering a commanding view of the lake. My lake. From the moment it was built, the residents of Prestwick Bluffs began to act as if the lake and the land surrounding it were part of their amenities package. I'd find beer cans on the shore, hear their loud parties echoing across the water, late at night. When I first moved in, I tried to be a good neighbor. I ignored the minor trespasses. But then the official-looking envelopes started appearing in my mailbox. The first one was a courtesy warning about the unmaintained state of the woodland border. Carol, in her official capacity, suggested I clear the underbrush on my side of the line, as it was a fire hazard and an eyesore. I filed it. The second was a formal notice of violation, fining me $200 for a dead tree visible from their precious clubhouse. The tree had been a nesting site for a pair of bald eagles for 3 years. I paid the fine. I didn't contest it, I simply sent a check. I wanted the cancel check. I wanted the paper trail. I wanted to establish a record of her overreach, of her asserting authority where she had none. On paper, her actions looked like a legitimate HOA functionary dealing with a recalcitrant property owner. But the paper was a lie, and I was collecting the evidence of it. I kept every letter, every envelope. I created a file. A simple manila folder labeled HOA. It grew thicker with each passing month. The fence was the line I had to draw, both literally and figuratively. The final straw had been a group of teenagers from the Bluffs having a bonfire on my shoreline, leaving behind a smoldering pit and a dozen broken bottles. It was a matter of liability and stewardship. So I decided to make the boundary clear. I didn't build a fortress. It was a rustic 3-rail fence, the kind you might see on a horse farm. It was aesthetically pleasing and unambiguous. Before I sank the first post, I spent a week in the woods with my own transit and GPS rover, locating the original survey monuments from the 1958 plat that had established this boundary. I found the iron pins, buried beneath decades of leaf litter, exactly where they were supposed to be. I flagged a line that was a full 5 feet inside my own property, just to be safe. Every post was planted squarely on land that had belonged to my wife's family for over a century, and Carol had just tried to tear it down with a tractor. Back in my office, I uploaded the video from my phone. I saved it in 3 separate locations, including a secure cloud server. I watched it again. Her words were crisp and clear. I am Carol Miller. I am the president of the Prestwick Bluffs Homeowners Association, and on their accord statement. This is community property, a clear, demonstrably false assertion. We will put a lien on your property, a direct threat. It was a beautiful little piece of evidence. Self-incriminating and delivered with such breathtaking arrogance. My next step was not to call the sheriff myself. It was not to storm over to her house. It was to do what I had always done when faced with a complex problem. I went back to my desk and got to work. I composed a letter. It was addressed to Miss Carol Miller and the Prestwick Bluffs HOA Board of Directors. It was polite, professional, and surgically precise. It stated in simple terms that a representative of the HOA had on this date and at this time entered my private property without permission and threatened to damage, a newly constructed fence. It referenced the video evidence I had secured. It then stated for the record that the fence was located entirely on my property, as legally described in Deed Book 482, page 116 of the county records. 1. Then came the part I hoped would give them pause. The part that was meant as a final, formal warning before the storm broke. I attached 2 documents to the letter. The first was a copy of the original 1958 survey plat, clear as day, showing the boundary line. The second was a high-resolution aerial photograph taken a week prior, on which I had digitally overlaid the surveyed property line. The photo showed my new fence running in a perfect, straight line 5 feet inside the boundary. It also showed something else, something I was sure they were aware of, but hoped no one else would ever notice. The southwestern corner of their gleaming $4 million clubhouse. The stone patio, the corner of the foundation, the meticulously landscaped flower beds around it. All of it, a triangular section, totaling nearly 2,000 square feet, was sitting neatly on my side of the line. I concluded the letter with a simple request. I demand that you and any agents of the HOA cease and desist from entering my property immediately. Please also be advised that your clubhouse constitutes a significant encroachment upon my land. Upon my land. I expect to hear from your legal counsel within 10 business days to discuss a resolution. I printed the letter, put it in a large envelope with the attachments, and drove to the post office. I sent it via certified mail. Return receipt requested. The little green card, when it came back with a signature, would be another piece of paper for the file. It was my formal documented attempt to resolve the matter quietly, an attempt I was almost certain she would ignore, while I waited for the inevitable escalation. I retreated to my sanctuary, the office. It was more of a library, paneled in dark cherry wood, filled with my father-in-law's books on forestry and my own collection of texts on land law, cartography, and engineering. It was the brain of the property. And for the next few days, it became my war room. I didn't leave the house. I had groceries delivered. I let my calls go to voicemail. I needed to focus, to assemble the entire history of this piece of land into an unbreachable fortress of facts. I made a call to David Chen, the bright young man I had mentored and eventually sold my firm to. David, I said, I have a personal project for you. I need a full title, search chain of title, and document retrieval on 2 parcels. And I need it yesterday. I gave him the parcel numbers for my property and the HOA's common area. David was like me, meticulous, relentless, and he loved digging through old records. He was the best corroborating professional I could ask for. As David worked on the official records, I worked on the physical ones. In the attic, in a dusty trunk, I found Eleanor's father's old files. He had been a man of quiet habits. He kept daily journals. I spent an entire day reading through them, cross-referencing dates with the development of Prestwick Bluffs. I found the entry, met with the developer, for the new subdivision today, he had written. Nice enough fellow. Promised to be a good neighbor, I told him he could let folks walk the old logging path so long as they were respectful. He seemed grateful. There it was. A permissive use, explicitly granted. That single entry would torpedo any claim they might try to make for a prescriptive easement, which requires use that is hostile and without the owner's permission. The certified mail receipt came back 3 days later, signed by the HOA's management company. The clock was ticking. The response I received was not from a lawyer. It was an email, forwarded to me by a generic address for the management company. The original message was from Carol, sent to the entire board of directors. Her tone was dismissive and mocking. Neighbors, we have received this ridiculous letter from the man next door. He seems to think his fence is on his property and has included some charmingly amateurish maps. He also makes a laughable claim about the clubhouse. Obviously, we will not be dignifying this with a response from our attorneys. I will handle this. Please disregard. She had no idea she had just created another piece of evidence. A written record of her willful ignorance and her instruction to the board to ignore a formal legal notice. I saved the email as a PDF and added it to the digital file. David called me on the 5th day. His voice was tight with excitement. Arthur, you are not going to believe this. I've got the whole package. Deeds, plats, easements, the works. But the real gold is in the permit filings for the clubhouse at the county planning office. What did you find? I asked, leaning forward in my chair. I found the original site plan they submitted to get their building permit, he said. It's stamped and approved. And on that plan, the clubhouse is set back a full 20 feet from the property line. It's located entirely on their land, exactly as it should be. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. And the as-built survey? I asked, already knowing the answer. An as-built survey is what a surveyor files after construction is complete to show the final, actual location of the structure. IDs, a requirement for the certificate of occupancy. That's the thing, David said, his voice dropping. There isn't one. It was never filed. They got a temporary C of O, conditional on the filing of the as-built. But the final was never issued. Arthur, as far as the county is concerned, that building's occupancy is technically not legal. Someone either made a massive error during construction, or they deliberately shifted the building and then forgot to file the final survey that would have exposed it. This was it, the bombshell. This was no longer a simple trespassing dispute between neighbors. This was, at best, gross negligence, and at worst, a conspiracy to commit fraud. They hadn't just built on my land, they had done so in violation of their own permits, and had covered it up by failing to file legally required documents. The foundation of their $4 million clubhouse wasn't just on my property. It was built on a bed of lies. On paper, their building was legal. In reality, it was a fraud. I thanked David and asked him to send over certified copies of everything. The file was nearly complete. All I needed now was for Carol to make her next move. I didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, a sheriff's deputy's car rolled slowly down my long gravel driveway. I was on the porch waiting for him, a folder in my hand. The deputy was young, professional, with a calm demeanor that suggested he'd seen his fair share of neighborhood squabbles. He got out of his car as Carol's luxury SUV pulled in behind him, kicking up a cloud of dust. She emerged, dressed in tennis whites, her face a mask of practiced concern. "Thank you for coming, officer," she said, striding toward him. "I'm Carol Miller, president of the association over there." She gestured toward Prestwick Bluffs. "I'm the one who called this man," she said, pointing at me, "has erected an illegal fence, blocking a community right-of-way, and when I attempted to discuss it with him, he became belligerent." The deputy turned to me. "Sir, I'm Deputy Evans. We had a call about a property dispute." "Good morning, Deputy," I said calmly. "I'm Arthur Vance. I'm the owner of this property. He's blocking access that has been used for decades." Carol interrupted, her voice filled with theatrical urgency. "It's a matter of public safety. Children use that path. It's called adverse possession. We have a right to be there." Deputy Evans held up a hand. "Ma'am, let me handle this." "Mr. Vance, can you tell me your side of the story?" "There really isn't a side," I said, keeping my voice even. "There are just the facts. I installed a fence on my private property, Ms. Miller came onto my property with a work crew and a tractor, and threatened to destroy it." "It's not your property," Carol insisted. I ignored her and looked at the deputy. "May I show you something?" I asked. I opened the folder I was holding. Inside was a single laminated sheet. On one side was a copy of my recorded deed. On the other was the new survey plat, stamped with the seal of a licensed state surveyor, showing the property lines and the precise location of the fence. I handed it to him. He took it and studied it for a long moment. He looked from the map to the fence line, then back to the map. He was trained to read official documents. He understood what he was looking at. Ms. Miller, he said, turning to her, his tone shifting subtly. Do you have a deed or a survey map that shows this land belongs to the HOA? She sputtered. Well, no, not with me. It's common knowledge. It's been this way for years. He can't just close it off. The deputy handed the sheet back to me. Ma'am, based on the documents Mr. Vance has provided, this fence appears to be on his property. A property dispute is a civil matter. It has to be handled in court. I can't order him to take down a fence on his own land based on common knowledge. Carol's face flushed with anger. So you're not going to do anything? He's threatening us. He has not threatened you in my presence, ma'am, the deputy said, his patience clearly wearing thin. He has been calm and cooperative. I'm telling you, this is for the courts to decide. There is no criminal act occurring here. I decided to add one final brick to my wall of evidence. Deputy Evans, I said, making sure to speak clearly for his body camera. For the record, could you please note in your report that I have presented you with a legally recorded deed, a state-licensed survey map identifying my property boundaries. And could you also note that Ms. Carol Miller has presented you with nothing but her opinion and has admitted she has no documentation to support her claim. The deputy's eyes flicked to me, a flicker of understanding, maybe even appreciation in them. Noted, sir, he said. He then turned to Carol. Ma'am, I suggest you contact an attorney. For now, you need to leave this property. If you return, Mr. Vance could have you charged with trespassing. Defeated and humiliated, Carol glared at me, then spun on her heel and marched back to her car. The deputy gave me a slight nod, advised me to call if there were any more trouble, and left. And the entire encounter had lasted less than 10 minutes. I went back inside and wrote a detailed, time-stamped summary of the event, referencing the deputy's name and the time of the call. I added it to the file. The foundation was now solid. The trap was set. All I had to do was wait for her to walk into it. The community, as it turned out, was not as monolithic as Carol believed. 2 evenings after the visit from the sheriff, a car I did not recognize drove up my driveway. An older man got out looking nervous. He carried a worn leather briefcase. Mr. Vance? He asked, approaching the porch where I was reading. My name is George Henderson. I live in Prestwick Bluffs. I was on the HOA board when the clubhouse was built. I invited him to sit. He was the fearful ally, the one I had hoped might exist. He had the haunted look of a man who had been on the losing end of too many arguments with people like Carol. I heard about what happened with the sheriff, he began, wringing his hands. And I got a copy of the letter you sent the board. Carol tried to bury it, but one of the newer members forwarded it around. I have to tell you, sir, you're right. You're absolutely right. He proceeded to tell me the whole story. He had been the treasurer back then. During excavation for the Clubhouse Foundation, they had hit a patch of unexpectedly unstable micaceous soil right where the building was supposed to go. The geotechnical engineer said it would require extensive, costly remediation. Deep piers drilled down to bedrock. The developer, a personal friend of the then HOA president, had a simpler solution. He just said, let's just move it 25 feet to the west. George recounted, his voice low and pained. The ground's better there, I objected. I told them that was getting awfully close to the property line. I said we needed a new survey. They told me to stop being an alarmist. The president said, "It's a gray area. Old Man Blackwood doesn't care about a few feet of woods." They held a vote in what they called an emergency executive session and approved the move. I was the only no vote. They never recorded the minutes from that meeting. He paused and opened his briefcase. "But I did," he said, pulling out a small, spiral-bound notebook. "I kept my own notes of every meeting. Here it is." He showed me the page. It was all there. The date, the attendees, the developer's proposal to shift the foundation, the 4-to-1 votes vote. It was a smoking gun. "Why are you telling me this now, George?" I asked gently. "Because I'm tired of her," he said, his voice hardening with a resolve I hadn't seen in him moments before. "She's a bully. She's ruined what was supposed to be a nice community. What she's doing to you is wrong, and what they did with that clubhouse was wrong. I'm retired. My house is paid for. What's she going to do? Fine me for having the wrong color petunias? I'll testify. I'll give you my notes." It's time someone stood up to her. George Henderson's testimony was invaluable. He was the conscience of the community, the witness to the original sin. His notes were the proof that the encroachment wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate choice made out of convenience and arrogance. The next day, I received an email from a Sarah Jenkins. She introduced herself as a current member of the HOA board. She was the one who had forwarded my letter. She was the disillusioned insider. She wrote that a few of them on the board were growing increasingly concerned about Carola's leadership and the potential legal exposure she was creating. She had heard Mr. Renke. Henderson was going to speak with me and wanted to offer her support. She confirmed that Carol had explicitly told the board not to engage legal counsel regarding my letter, stating it was a frivolous scare tactic. This was another crucial piece. Proof that the board had been formally warned and that the president had willfully ignored the warning, neglecting her fiduciary duty. The coalition was forming. I was no longer just a lone landowner. I was becoming the focal point for a community's correction. Carol, feeling her power base begin to crumble, made her final, desperate move. I was served with a lawsuit. Adas, her lawyer on behalf of the HOA, had filed for an emergency injunction to force the removal of my fence and to grant them a temporary prescriptive easement for the historic path. It was a classic legal bullying tactic. File an aggressive, expensive lawsuit, hoping the other party will fold rather than bear the cost and stress of a fight. It was her final escalation, the over-the-top move of a cornered animal. And it was the biggest mistake she could have possibly made. She had just voluntarily moved the conflict into a courtroom, the one place on earth where her bluster and performance meant nothing, and my paper trail meant everything. She had brought the war to my home ground. I hired a lawyer, a man named Marcus Thorne, who had been a friendly rival for years in complex commercial zoning cases. He was like me, older, semi-retired, and possessed of a deep and abiding love for the clear, cold logic of the law. When I laid out the file on his conference table of the deeds, the surveys, the video, the deputy's report, George's notes, Sarah's emails, the permit discrepancies, was silent for a long time. He put on his reading glasses and examined each document. Finally, he took off the glasses, leaned back in his leather chair, and a slow grin spread across his face. "Arthur," he said, "this is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. They haven't just brought a knife to a gunfight. They've brought a sternly worded letter to a tactical nuclear strike. We filed our response. We did not just deny their claims. We filed a countersuit. For trespass, for damages, for a quiet title action to permanently and legally establish the boundary, and for an order of ejectment, which would legally require them to remove the encroaching portion of their clubhouse from my property. We attached every single piece of evidence. The court date, for the injunction hearing was set for 2 weeks later. The day of the hearing arrived. The courtroom was a small, wood-paneled affair, but it was packed. Nearly half of the residents of Prestwick Bluffs were there, a sea of pastel polo shirts and concerned faces. They were there to support Carol, to witness the swift legal smackdown of the unreasonable old man next door. Carol sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by her lawyer, looking confident and serene. She nodded and smiled at her supporters. She was performing. Mr. Henderson and Sarah sat with me behind Marcus. They both looked nervous, but resolute. I felt a calm settle over me. This was just another job. The evidence was collected, the analysis was complete, and now it was time to present the findings. The HOA lawyer went first. He was slick and theatrical, painting a picture of a tight-knit community, whose cherished traditions were being threatened by a hostile newcomer. He spoke of children who could no longer walk to the lake, of elderly residents who had lost their favorite walking path. He put Carol on the stand. She was a master performer. Says. Her voice trembled with emotion as she spoke of her duty to her community. She described my fence as a wall of aggression. She spoke of the historic path as if it were the Oregon Trail, a sacred trust passed down through generations. She lied. Beautifully and convincingly, under oath. Then it was Marcuse's turn. He didn't rise with a dramatic flourish. He walked slowly to the lectern, my file in his hands. Your Honor, he began, his voice calm and dry. We are not here today to talk about a fence. Fences can be moved. We are not here to talk about a walking path. Paths can be rerouted. We are here to talk about something much more fundamental. A line that was legally established in 1958 and has been legally recognized on every tax bill and deed transfer since. He started methodically, piece by piece. He entered my deed into evidence. He entered the 1958 plat map. He entered the new survey I had commissioned. He called the county tax assessor to the stand, who confirmed that my family had paid property taxes on the disputed land for over 80 years, and the HOA had paid none. With each document, with each witness, the narrative began to shift. The confident murmurs from Carol's side of the gallery grew quiet. Her serene smile tightened. Marcus then called, Deputy Evans. Marcus then called Deputy. He recounted his visit professionally, confirming that I had presented legal documents while Ms. Miller had not. He confirmed that I had been calm and she had been agitated. Marcus had his body cam footage admitted into evidence. Then he called George Henderson. George was nervous at first, but his voice grew stronger as he told the story of the clubhouse construction. He presented his notebook. The HOA's lawyer objected furiously, but the judge allowed it, his expression now grim. The story of the deliberate decision to shift the foundation to save money hung in the air. Finally, Marcus pulled out the bombshells. He submitted the original approved site plan from the county, showing the clubhouse safely on HOA land. Then he called the records clerk from the county planning department. She testified that no as-built survey had ever been filed for the Prestwick Bluffs clubhouse, and therefore no final certificate of occupancy had ever been issued. A wave of shock rippled through the courtroom. The residents were realizing their $4 million community centerpiece wasn't technically legal. Then came the final, killing blow. Marcus placed a large new survey map on an easel, facing the judge. Your Honor, this is a boundary and encroachment survey conducted by my client, a licensed surveyor for 40 years, and corroborated by his firm. It was conducted last week using state-of-the-art GPS and ground-penetrating radar technology. He pointed to the map. As you can see, the legally established boundary is here. The fence my client erected is here, 5 feet inside his own property. And this, he said, tapping a large red-shaded triangle, is the southwest corner of the Prestwick Bluffs Clubhouse. 17% of the building's footprint, including a load-bearing section of its foundation, sits squarely, undeniably, on Mr. Vance's land. He turned to face the HOA's table. Their entire claim for an injunction is based on a fiction. They are not the victims here. They are the trespassers. And they have been, on a massive and ongoing scale, for the last 5 years. I looked at Carol. The mask was gone. Her face, which had been a carefully constructed performance of confident authority, was utterly blank. Her eyes were wide with a horror that was just beginning to dawn. She wasn't just going to lose the argument over the fence. She was going to lose the clubhouse. She had no idea. She had no idea how thoroughly she had been outmaneuvered, how completely her world of bluff and bluster had just collided with a world of cold, hard, measurable fact. In the dead silence of the courtroom, you could hear the sound of a $4 million building beginning to dissolve on paper. It was hers. On the ground, where it mattered, it was mine. The judge, a stern-looking woman with no tolerance for nonsense, stared at the survey map for a full minute. She took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. She looked at the HOA's lawyer, who was pale and seemed to be shrinking in his suit. "Counselor," she said to him, her voice dangerously quiet, "do you have anything to rebut this? Any survey, any deed, any piece of evidence at all that contradicts what I am looking at?" The lawyer could only stammer, "Your Honor, we were not aware of these discrepancies. We will need time to consult with our client." "You filed for an emergency injunction," the judge snapped, her voice now like ice. "You came into this court and you accused this man of illegal actions, demanding immediate relief. You did this without, apparently, doing the most basic due diligence. You didn't pull a deed. You didn't commission a survey. You didn't even check your own permit filings at the county office. You wasted this court's time with a frivolous and baseless action." She turned her gaze on Carol. "And you, Miss Miller, you testified under oath that this was community property. On what did you base that assertion?" Carol was speechless. She just stared, her mouth slightly open. The judge banged her gavel. "The plaintiff's motion for an injunction is denied with prejudice. I am awarding Mr. Vance's legal fees to be paid in full by the Prestwick Bluffs HOA. Furthermore, based on the evidence of encroachment presented here today, I am granting a temporary injunction against the HOA. They are hereby barred from using or occupying their clubhouse until the matter of Mr. Vance's countersuit for ejectment is resolved. This court is adjourned." The collapse was total and immediate. The gallery erupted not in anger at me, but in panicked questions directed at Carol. Her supporters, who had arrived ready for a victory parade, now looked at her with betrayal in their eyes. She had led them off a cliff. She didn't say a word. She just gathered her purse and practically fled the courtroom, her lawyer trailing behind her like a kicked puppy. The aftermath was swift. The HOA's insurance carrier, faced with our mountain of evidence and the potential cost of having to demolish and rebuild a multi-million-dollar structure, took over. They fired Carol's lawyer and brought in their own team of realists. Carol was removed as president in a stormy emergency meeting a week later, where George Henderson and Sarah Jenkins laid out the full extent of her negligence and deceit. The HOA's developer was sued by the insurance company to recoup their losses. It was a complete and total unraveling. Their new lawyers contacted Marcus. They wanted to settle. I had no desire to be punitive. I didn't want a pile of rubble on my property line. I wanted peace. I wanted the principle of the matter to be established. So I proposed a solution. I wouldn't force them to tear down the building. Instead, I would sell them the 2,000-square-foot parcel of land on which their clubhouse stood. The price would be based on the highest commercial appraisal value, which, given its proximity to the lake, was substantial. Additionally, they would pay a one-time encroachment penalty, of $500,000, which conveniently covered my legal fees and my time, and established a fund for the long-term maintenance of the property line. There were two non-negotiable conditions. First, the new HOA board, led by President Sarah Jenkins, had to issue a formal, written apology to me, which would be mailed to every single homeowner in Prestwick Bluffs, retracting all of Carol's accusations. Second, they had to conduct a full audit of all fines issued during Carol's last tenure and refund any that were found to be arbitrary or outside the scope of the covenants. They agreed to everything without hesitation. The community began to heal. The culture of fear and intimidation that Carol had fostered evaporated. The new board was reasonable and communicative. The ridiculous rules were rescinded. People started talking to each other again. Sarah and George became good friends of mine. We would have dinner on my porch occasionally, looking out over the lake, and marvel at how a simple dispute over a fence could have detonated an entire suburban fiefdom. A few months later, the final papers were signed. The wire transfer appeared in my account. The first thing I did was contact a land trust and endow the Blackwood Manor Conservation Fund, ensuring that the 2,200 acres would remain undeveloped and wild in perpetuity. A memorial to Eleanor and her family. Her legacy was now secure. I am sitting on the porch again, in the same rocking chair. Etah's early morning, just like that day when it all began. My coffee is warm in my hands. The mist is rising off the lake. The split-rail fence stands untouched, a quiet line in the landscape. Further down, near the clubhouse, a new set of granite survey monuments, paid for by the HOA, marks the new, legally indisputable property line. Each one is capped with a brass disc, stamped with my own surveyor's license number. A permanent, physical record of the truth. I think about the nature of ownership. Carol thought it was about power, about control, about what you could take through sheer force of will. She thought a story repeated often enough becomes the truth. But she was wrong. Ownership, true stewardship, isn't about dominion. It's about responsibility. It's about knowing the history of the land under your feet. It's about honoring the lines, both visible and invisible, that define our relationship with the world and with each other. Etas, about watas, on paper. The old worn deed from 1958 sits on my desk, inside the file that is now thick with legal victories. It is a tangible thing, a distillation of history and law. It does not have an opinion. It doesn't perform for an audience, it simply states the facts. And in the end, the facts are all that matter. The air is quiet, the peace has returned, the order is restored, and it is a deep, long, satisfying exhale.